Yo, what up? My name's Braden, and welcome back to Music Philosophy, the show where I dive maybe a little too deep into all sorts of musical concepts. I make a video like this every week, so if you're interested in more, be sure to subscribe. Today, we're talking about quintuplets. In this video, I'll tell you why they can be so intimidating, why they're worth learning, and how you can go about learning them. And then I'll tell you how you can use these rhythms to create grooves with a completely unique feel to them. Let's get into it. Music Philosophy. So, these guys. They divide a beat into 5 equal parts, and are classically known as quintuplets. But in the marching percussion world where I come from, we call them 5-lets. And that's the name I'm going to be using in this video, because it extends really easily to 6-lets, 7-lets, 11-lets, with maximum clarity. And I want to keep things as consistent as possible, so that means I'll even be calling sets of 8th notes 2-lets, triplets 3-lets, and 16th notes 4-lets. Hey kids! I'm Brody McScience. Hey, so look, 2-lets and 4-lets are real rhythms in music, and for reasons I don't really understand, they usually take up the space of 3 8th notes. Now I need you to dump that garbage out of your head, alright? Get it out of there. We're using a different definition of tuplet in this video, so repeat after me. An n-let separates a single beat into n parts. You didn't say anything. What do I say now? So 2-let, check it out. 2-let separates a single beat into 2 parts. That's just 8th notes, right? We all know those ones. As far as I'm concerned, there should always just be a 2 that's kind of implicitly written on top. A 4-let, single beat into 4 parts. That's just 16th notes. Look at that. Oh my gosh. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. It's weird if I gotta go like, here's a 5-let and here's 16th notes. It's like, no, I want to say 5-let and 4-let because it's much easier to compare, all right? Now, why do so many people have such difficulty with this rhythm? The task seems pretty simple. Divide the beat into 5 equal parts. And yet many struggle to wrap their heads around it. Because 5 is a prime number, it's impossible to break the rhythm down into smaller building blocks, so it's difficult to know where to start. We're going to come back to this idea of building blocks in a second, but first I need to motivate the idea that these odd tuplets are even worth learning. There's a sort of stigma against less frequent rhythms like 5-lets and 7-lets. Almost a belief that they are inherently uncomfortable and jerky. Now quickly I should clarify, when I say a groove is on an n-let bass, what I mean is that that groove is primarily made up and felt on that subdivision. You can absolutely have a 3-let in music on a 2-let bass. But the point is that's a deviation. There's always a home bass that we can return to. Most of the music we listen to boils down to either a 2-let bass or a 3-let bass. And there's a survivorship bias. Those are the rhythms we use because those are the rhythms that feel good. If music on a 5-let bass felt as good, then we would use it just as much. We don't, so it must feel worse. But that just isn't true. 5-let music can sound just as good as the more traditional rhythms, and if you don't believe me, let's stop and just turn up the drum beat that's been playing in the background this whole time. It's a beat based in 5, and importantly, you didn't notice. At no point did you think, whoa, this beat is so wonky and jerky. It just kind of grooves. And think about it, we can make nice grooves out of 2s, 3s, 4s, 6s, 8s. Why would 5s or 7s be different? Of course, that doesn't mean it's as easy to make something smooth with them, which we'll get into in a minute, but it's certainly possible. Hopefully just that possibility motivates you to spend some more time with these rhythms. These are completely different worlds with completely different sounds that you could explore. I think the biggest reason 5-lets can be difficult is there's nothing to relate them back to. Let's return to this idea of rhythmic building blocks. When you break it down, there's only 2 blocks that make up the vast majority of all rhythms, 2s and 3s. Even when you want to play a 4-let, you really break it up into 2 2-lets. If you want to play a 6-let, you break it up either into 2 3-lets or 3 2-lets. 2s and 3s are words in a language, and we can string them together to make sentences. If we look at this rhythmic phrase, or sentence, we can break it down into the individual words that create it, and that'll help us play it. But if we want to play a fivelet, there's no smaller subdivision we can use to build it. You may be thinking you could separate it into 3 and a 2, or a 2 and a 3, but that's not actually very useful. It does nothing to tell you how to actually place 5 notes evenly in the space. If you try to divide it like that, you'll probably end up with something more similar to this, or, and not. What that means is the fivelet is itself a building block, and that's why it can be difficult to learn. You're not just learning an application of a tool you already know, you're learning an entirely new tool. It's a whole new word in the language. Contrast that to trying to play a 9-let, where you're really taking the 3-let words you already know and applying it in a new way. You take a 3-let, and you make each partial of that 3-let its own 3-let to get 9 total notes in the tuplet. When you break it down like that, the whole thing still kind of just feels like 3-lets. There's nothing too new about it. But to learn a 5-let, you have to discover an entirely new sound, a new feeling. And to make that harder, unlike 2s and 3s, that sound isn't very common. It's not a word that's used a lot. I pretty clearly remember learning what a 3-let was in my 5th grade percussion class, in my 2nd lesson ever. As soon as it was demonstrated to me, I was like, oh, I know that sound. I hear that sound all the time. It was just like attaching a label to something I already knew, a word I spoke but didn't know the name of. When I sat down years later to learn 5-lets, it was significantly harder. Without that prior exposure, it's like learning a new word, but you don't actually know what that word is, you just know the equation to get there. I would just sit there, with my metronome beeping away, trying to understand what a division by 5 felt like. I could let the metronome fill it in and follow along, but as soon as I turned off the subdivision, I struggled to recreate it. And then even after a practice session with some success, I would come back later and have forgotten, unable to recall the feeling. But now that I know it and can say it fluently, so to speak, I just kind of know what a 5-let feels like, but I had to go through that process to get there. And the reason it's so intimidating to people is because that process is unlike traditional practice. You're not building something new with the tools you know. You have to learn a whole new tool. You have to turn on the metronome and let yourself feel completely stupid. It feels like starting from scratch. It's uncomfortable. And because you know the 2-let and 3-let words so well, it can be really hard to ever break away from them. The best advice that helped me is to attach a real word to the rhythm that can help you understand it. For me, that word was hippopotamus. Hippopotamus, 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 hippopotamus. But I've also heard people use opportunity. It's really whatever word works for you. Attaching real language to the rhythm can help you stop thinking purely rhythmically. You'll think a little bit more linguistically, which will help you add a new word to your dictionary. Now, 2s, 3s, and 5s are building blocks because they're prime numbers. You can't divide them evenly into anything smaller. So it follows that all the bigger primes are building blocks as well. And I could say something exciting, like, since there are infinite prime numbers, that means there are infinite blocks we could build with. And believe me, I thought about it. But in practice, as soon as you get any bigger than, say, 13 if you're crazy, they just become way too big and unwieldy to actually use. And the reason for this is like I mentioned earlier. Just because building a stable groove is possible with all these blocks does not mean it's equally easy to do so. So grooves on a 5-let bass can be more difficult because music is a balance of expectations. You want to lead and mislead the listener in a satisfying way. If you overly defy expectations, it'll just come across as chaotic. And, well, they'll probably just say bad. And think about it, when you deviate from the expected 2s and 3s, that's already a defiance. You've already tipped the scales, and you've left yourself less room to experiment. If you were to take that all the way to 13-lets, well, you've tipped the scales a lot. It'd be really difficult to balance that out. And that's not to say it's impossible, but you should be conscious of that. To demonstrate this, I generated a completely random beat on a 2-let bass and a 5-let bass using the same parameters and put them to a click. Let's listen to the 2-let one first. It's really not that bad, but let's compare it to the 5-let beat. It's kind of like getting pelted with rocks. Because 2s are so familiar, you can get away with a lot more, but 5s, you have to be more careful or it can just sound like noise. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that this is a good or a bad thing. It's absolutely an effect you can use in your music if that's the effect you want. But in order to create a groove out of 5-lets that people would want to dance to, we have to kind of mimic features that they would expect to maintain that balance of expectations. Let's revisit this 5-let bass background beat. I'm going to play a couple bars and then morph it into a quarter note outline of itself. See what you notice. Behind the fivelets is a really simple 3/4 groove. The overall structure of the beat is familiar and predictable, which gives it a really solid foundation. But that's not the only thing rooting it in the familiar. Listen to the hi-hat real quick. We're essentially mimicking a classic swing pattern here. Long, short, long, short, long. Listen to the phrase one more time, and then I'll play the more familiar 3-lit equivalent, and listen to how similar they are. So, to make fivelets groove like this, it's all about the balance. Simply by choosing fivelets as the base of our rhythm tips the scales against us, but by keeping the content predictable, we can keep it all balanced. You take something new and unexpected, but you utilize it in a familiar way. If you want to get better at playing odd tuplets, try writing some grooves with them. Give them a shot. There's a ton of things you can do, and just listening to them regularly will help you familiarize yourself with their language. I recommend trying in either a DAW or a music notation software so that you can have the beat played back to you accurately. Remember, the reason a fivelet is hard to learn is because it's not a word that's spoken very regularly. If you expose yourself to it by listening to them a lot, you'll start to have a much better understanding of how the word is spoken. And while you try it, you'll probably think to yourself, man, these rhythms are horrible to work with in music software. And I couldn't agree more. In fact, I already made a video about the limitations of time signatures and music notation that, if you like this video, you'll certainly find interesting. It's all about how experimentation with these kinds of rhythms feels almost discouraged by our notation system. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Music Philosophy. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. I've decided to do these weekly, and you're not going to want to miss the next one. In the meantime, you can click here to watch that time signatures video, here to watch the previous episode, and here to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.